The year was Sempach-Joluk, and the mountains of Adwa burned beneath an African sun. Tens of thousands of men and women moved like a living storm, barefoot soldiers carrying spears, rifles, and prayers. At their head rode a man in a white robe and golden crown, calm as stone, watching Europe's most modern army crumble before him. His name was Menelik II, Emperor of Ethiopia, the only African ruler who shattered a European empire on the battlefield. While other nations were carved apart by colonial hands, Ethiopia stood tall. Because one man refused to bow, this is not just a story of war. It is the story of the last independent African kingdom, of courage wrapped in silence, and of a crown that refused to kneel before the world's greatest powers. He was born in Sempach-Joluk, in Ankober, a mist-wrapped town, high in the mountains of Shoa. His birth name was Salah Mariam, the son of King Haile Melekot, and a woman of noble but contested lineage. The Ethiopia he entered was not the one found in modern atlases. It was a country divided by faith, by tribe, by ambition, a mosaic of kingdoms loosely tied to the legend of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. From his earliest years, Menelik's destiny was entangled with prophecy. The clergy whispered that this child carried the blood of Solomon. His tutors said he carried the burden of Ethiopia's redemption. As a boy, he watched caravans bringing salt and muskets through narrow mountain passes, and he learned quickly that a ruler who could control trade could control life itself. But Ethiopia in the mid-9th century was far from stable. To the north, Emperor Tewodros II had risen through sheer will and violence, uniting lands long divided. His dream was to forge one empire, but his methods were fire and iron. The Shuan court, where Menelik grew up, looked upon Tewodros with both admiration and fear. They saw in him the same hunger that once fueled the great kings of Axum, and the same madness that destroyed them. When Menelik's father died, the boy was barely 11. The emperor summoned him to the imperial fortress at Magdala, not as a guest but as a hostage, a common practice among Ethiopian rulers to ensure the loyalty of regional kings. For the next decade, the young prince would live under guard, surrounded by stone walls and whispers of rebellion. Yet it was here, in captivity, that Menelik learned the art of patience. He studied the way Tewodros ruled, the way he punished dissent, how he inspired devotion, how he failed to listen when his pride grew louder than his faith. Menelik observed everything, spoke little, and waited. Prisoners have two choices: to break or to transform. The boy from Shua chose the second. In the evenings, he sat near the fortress windows, gazing at the distant blue ridges of his homeland. The winds that reached him carried the faint smell of incense and dust, the scent of Shoa. He swore that one day he would return there not as a prisoner, but as a liberator. The boy who watched the empire through bars began to imagine an Ethiopia that was whole again, not by sword alone, but by the unity of its people. By the time he escaped Magdala in Sempach-Joluk, Menelik was no longer the boy who had been taken. He had become something else, a man who had learned power by studying its cruelty. Menelik's escape from Magdala was almost mythic. Disguised as a peasant trader, he slipped out through mountain ravines at night, guided only by the stars and the faith of loyal companions. Each step toward Shua was a step away from submission. He crossed rivers, swollen by the rainy season, passed through villages still loyal to the emperor, and vanished before dawn. By the time Tewodros discovered the disappearance, Menelik had already reached the outskirts of his ancestral lands. But freedom came with a price. Shua was in turmoil. Old nobles fought for control, and local chieftains eyed Menelik with suspicion. Yet the people saw in him a symbol of continuity, the rightful heir to their province. Within months, Menelik rallied warriors under his banner and reclaimed the throne of Shoa. He was only 21. Unlike Tewodros, who ruled by fear, Menelik ruled by calculation. He rebuilt alliances not through intimidation, but through marriage, trade, and persuasion. He married Bafina Wold Mikel, a powerful noblewoman who strengthened his hold among rival clans. He negotiated with Muslim chiefs, Christian priests, and wandering traders alike, speaking the language of coexistence in an age of conquest. He began modernizing Shua's army, purchasing weapons from French and British merchants who were eager to sell firearms for ivory and gold. Villages that had once fought each other were now forging spears side by side. Roads were repaired, markets reopened, and caravans once again flowed through the heart of the highlands. Menelik's palace became a place of both ceremony and strategy. At night, by lamplight, he studied maps of Ethiopia, not the ones drawn by Europeans, but the oral maps told by travelers, describing the paths through mountains, the tribes that guarded each valley, the rivers that marked the boundaries of kingdoms. He understood that geography, not just gunpowder, was the true power of Ethiopia. Meanwhile, the shadow of Tewodros loomed. The emperor grew increasingly paranoid, lashing out at both his enemies and his own allies. In Sempach-Beok-Hardafe, when British forces invaded to free European hostages, Tewodros chose suicide over surrender. The fortress of Magdala, once Menelik's prison, became his first triumph, reclaimed not by his hand but by destiny's turning wheel. In the aftermath, Menelik emerged as one of the few strong rulers left standing in Ethiopia. He had survived captivity, rebellion, and imperial collapse. Now, he turned his eyes toward a greater vision, not just to rule Shoa, but to unite a divided land. He was still young, but history had already carved patience into his face. Those who met him spoke of his calm gaze, his deliberate words, and the strange certainty that Ethiopia's future rested upon his shoulders. Menelik knew that the world beyond the mountains was changing, that Europe's hunger for Africa was growing, and he intended to meet that hunger not with submission, but with strategy. The boy who once lived behind walls was now preparing to build one vast enough to shield an entire nation. By the early Sempicha, Kaisjerbyo, Menelik's rule over Shua had become something rare in the Ethiopian highlands, stable, pragmatic, and forward-looking. He inherited a land scarred by decades of civil war, where roads were broken and loyalty was bought with grain. Yet within a few years, caravans again wound through the mountain passes, carrying salt from afar, coffee from Sidamo, and cloth from the coast. The sound of hammers and markets returned, echoing through the valleys. Menelik's rule was built not merely on military might but on trust. He understood that Ethiopia's power lay not in conquest alone, but in the loyalty of its many peoples: Oromo, Amhara, Guraj, and Somali, all bound by shared survival. He rarely forced submission. Instead, he persuaded and absorbed. Through diplomacy and arranged marriages, he wove Shua into a network of alliances. His new capital at Entoto, perched on a cold and windy hill, became a symbol of renewal, the heart from which a unified Ethiopia would later emerge. Trade, too, became a form of statecraft. Menelik encouraged foreign merchants to visit his court, not as conquerors, but as partners. He welcomed envoys from France, Britain, and Italy, listening more than he spoke. The Europeans thought him naive, a provincial king, dazzled by gifts of rifles and watches. They were wrong. Menelik understood every offer was a trap and every treaty a test. He accepted the weapons, but not the leash. At night, he would stand on Entoto's ridge, watching the distant lightning flash over the plains. Beyond those plains lay the coastal territories, where European powers, especially Italy, were tightening their grip. Menelik knew that to survive, Shua must become more than a province. It must become the beating heart of a new Ethiopia. He began reorganizing the army, training it not just to fight tribal wars, but to face disciplined European soldiers. Gunsmiths worked tirelessly in workshops near the palace. Cannons purchased from French merchants arrived by camel from the Red Sea, their iron mouths gleaming in the sun. Menelik trained his generals to coordinate supply lines, communications, and reconnaissance, ideas rare in African warfare of the time. Yet he was not merely a warrior. He was a builder. He established schools where priests taught reading, geography, and the art of governance. He urged his people to look beyond their valleys and think in the language of nations. Ethiopia, he believed, could be modern without being conquered, a rare vision in the age of empire. When Emperor Johannes IV rose in the north, claiming the imperial throne, Menelik bent the knee, at least in appearance. He knew that outright confrontation would only exhaust the country. Instead, he bided his time, strengthening Shua under the guise of loyalty. He waited for history to open the right door. That door would arrive soon enough, not from within Ethiopia, but from the corridors of Europe, in Sempach-Behapach-Jusi. While Menelik was consolidating his rule in the highlands, the world's most powerful men gathered thousands of miles away in Berlin. Around a grand table glittering with maps and brandy glasses, they divided Africa like merchants, carving a carcass. Lines were drawn through deserts, jungles, and kingdoms through lives they would never see. Ethiopia, proud and ancient, appeared to them as an empty space, a prize yet unclaimed. To Italy, newly unified and eager for empire, Africa offered a chance to prove itself among older European powers. Their eyes fell upon the Red Sea coast. By Sempach-Beapachu, Italian troops had seized Eritrea, establishing it as their colony. Step by step, the noose tightened around Ethiopia's northern borders. But Menelik had been watching. He had long maintained correspondence with European monarchs, Queen Victoria, Tsar Alexander III, and even the King of Italy. His letters were written in measured tones, polite yet firm, declaring Ethiopia's sovereignty in every line. He traded ivory and gold for weapons, but his purpose was clear: modernization as defense. When Emperor Johannes IV was killed in battle against the modest Sudanese in Sempach-Bejuku, the empire again stood at a crossroads. Menelik, now the strongest surviving ruler, was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia. The timing could not have been more perilous. Italy moved swiftly, congratulating him while pushing forward a document, the Treaty of Wuchale. On the surface, the treaty seemed fair. Recognition of Menelik's sovereignty, boundaries between Ethiopia and Eritrea, promises of friendship. But in its Italian version lay a poisonous clause. It claimed that Ethiopia had agreed to become a protectorate under Italy's guidance, giving Rome control of all foreign relations. Menelik signed the Amharic version, unaware of the deception until foreign ambassadors began addressing him through Italian channels, treating him as a vassal. The discovery ignited his fury. In the imperial palace, he summoned his ministers, raised the treaty high, and declared, "We do not accept to be treated as children. Ethiopia has never been anyone's protectorate." The words spread like fire through the mountains. Priests preached them in Sunday sermons. Soldiers carved them into their shields. Italy, still confident in its superiority, dismissed his anger as pride. They did not understand that this pride was the essence of Ethiopian identity forged over centuries of independence when the rest of Africa fell under foreign flags. Menelik began stockpiling arms and fortifying his alliances. He reached out to the provinces, calling upon every noble, every peasant, every monk, who still remembered what freedom meant. Across Ethiopia, church bells began to toll not for prayer, but for preparation. Europe might have drawn its lines on paper, but Menelik would draw his on the battlefield. The shadow of Italy had fallen, and Ethiopia was ready to fight in the light of its own dawn. The year was Sempach-Bejuku, and the ink on the Treaty of Wuchale had barely dried when Menelik began to sense that something was wrong. Letters from foreign courts, once addressed directly to the Emperor of Ethiopia, now arrived through Italian intermediaries. Diplomats from Europe began referring to him as a protected monarch, a client of the Kingdom of Italy. To the world's eyes, it seemed Ethiopia had quietly surrendered its sovereignty. But Menelik's eyes were sharp, and his memory long. He called for both versions of the treaty to be read side by side, the Amharic and the Italian. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. In Article Justi, the Amharic text stated that the emperor may use the Italian government for communication with other powers, if he wishes. The Italian version, however, twisted it into, must use the Italian government. One word had turned a friendship into a chain. Menelik's fury was not loud. It was silent, cold, deliberate, the kind of anger that makes history move. He tore the treaty apart and summoned his ministers, declaring, "The Italians have deceived us. Ethiopia is not a protectorate. It is a kingdom that bows to no one but God." From that moment, diplomacy became defiance. Menelik sent envoys across Europe to expose Italy's lie, and the world began to listen. France and Russia, eager to curb Italian ambition, quietly began supplying him with rifles and artillery. In the highlands, blacksmiths melted old iron into spearheads, and priests blessed every weapon with holy water. Italy, however, refused to retreat. They believed Menelik was bluffing, that Ethiopia was too backward, too divided to resist. The colonial press in Rome painted the emperor as a savage in a crown, a man playing king. Italian officers spoke with arrogance, convinced that a few battalions of European troops could crush an African army within days. Menelik saw their arrogance for what it was, a gift. He began to build his defense, not only with steel, but with unity. He summoned the governors of Tigray, Gojam, Wollo, and Harar to his court. Many had been rivals for decades, but he reminded them that this war was not for him alone. If Ethiopia falls, he said, no one's crown will remain. We will all wear chains. His words resonated like thunder across the mountains. Warriors from every corner of the empire began to march toward Shoa. Old enemies fought side by side. Christian priests rode with Quranic scholars. Farmers left their fields to join militias, carrying rifles, axes, even stones. Women brought water, mended uniforms, cooked meals for soldiers on the road. For the first time in living memory, Ethiopia moved as one. In Sempach-Paktu Juwo, when Italy invaded from Eritrea, they expected to face fragmented resistance. Instead, they met a human storm carrying faith instead of fear. Menelik established his headquarters in the northern town of Dessie, where he personally oversaw logistics, armament, and communication. Every message, every bullet, every prayer flowed through him. As winter turned to spring, the emperor's resolve only deepened. In his tent, he prayed by candlelight before the icons of St. George, whispering the same words he had once spoken as a boy behind prison walls. I was born to see Ethiopia free. The trap of the treaty had failed. Now Italy would meet the consequence of its deception not with diplomacy, but with war. In early Sempach-Paktu rose, Ethiopia rose like a tide of earth. Across the plateaus and valleys, drums echoed from village to village, war drums, carved from ox hide, thundering through the dawn. Men carried spears wrapped in cloth, rifles on their shoulders, and crosses tied to their necks. Women followed behind with sacks of grain and water gourds. Even children joined, singing hymns that spoke of justice and survival. From his camp in Addis Ababa, Emperor Menelik issued a proclamation. Let every man who has 2 spears give one to his brother. Let every man who has bread share it with his comrade. The God of Ethiopia walks with us, and we shall not be slaves. The army that answered his call was not merely an army, it was a nation in motion. Over Juman soldiers marched northward, gathering strength from every province. They carried old muskets, sabers, and modern rifles, imported from Russia and France. Behind them rode priests chanting prayers, their robes fluttering like banners of faith. The roads filled with chants, songs, and the dust of a country reborn. Meanwhile, Italian General Oreste Baratieri waited in Eritrea with around Ichman men, confident in Europe's superiority. His officers assured him the Ethiopians would break at the first cannon fire. They underestimated not only Menelik's discipline, but also the fire that burned in the hearts of his people. Menelik's army moved with order and precision. Scouts mapped the terrain. Supply lines carried food and ammunition from Addis Ababa to the northern front. The emperor's wife, Empress Tetu Betul, commanded her own division, leading thousands of men from her native province of Wollo. She organized logistics, built field hospitals, and personally motivated the troops. To the soldiers, she was the Lioness of Ethiopia. By February, Sempach-Paktu both armies stood on the edge of history near the rugged hills of Adwa. The air crackled with tension. Menelik addressed his generals for the last time before battle. We have waited centuries for this moment. They have the rifles, but we have the mountain. They have maps, but we have the will. God and our ancestors are with us. At night, fires dotted the hills like stars fallen to earth. Soldiers whispered prayers, their hands resting on their weapons. Some spoke of their families, others of the land they swore to protect. In the stillness before dawn, Menelik walked among them silently. Touching the shoulder of each man, he passed a gesture both royal and human. He knew that this was no ordinary battle. It was the hinge of destiny, the day Africa would either bow or stand. As the first rays of light crept over the mountains, horns blared and drums thundered. The Ethiopians advanced, singing hymns that rolled like waves through the valley. Menelik lifted his cross-topped staff and whispered, "For Ethiopia." The Battle of Adwa had begun. The dawn of Sempachpaktu Drolon and Sangit's Edert broke cold and red. The mountains around Adwa glowed beneath a rising sun, their slopes veiled in mist and gunpowder smoke. In the valleys below, tens of thousands of Ethiopians stood ready, barefoot, hungry, exhausted, but unbroken. Across the hills, the Italian army moved like a machine of iron and arrogance, believing the day would end with Africa kneeling. General Baratieri's forces had advanced in darkness, guided by faulty maps and false intelligence. They believed Menelik's camp lay scattered, unaware. In truth, it was a trap not born of European strategy, but of the mountain's own patience. Ethiopian scouts had already surrounded the Italians, marking their routes and cutting their lines of retreat. As the sun lifted, the first cannon roared. The Italians fired from the ridges, their shells shrieking across the rocky terrain. Dust and cries filled the air. Menelik, seated upon his horse, raised a bronze cross toward the sky and prayed, "O Lord, give strength to Ethiopia. Let not our enemies mock us this day." Then he gave the order to advance. The Ethiopian warriors surged forward, waves of men from Tigray, Gojam, Shoa, and Wollo, each shouting the ancient cry of, "Ethiopia shall never kneel." The ground shook beneath their charge. Italian lines, drilled in European fashion, struggled to hold against the sheer momentum of faith and fury. Empress Tetu Betul directed the artillery from the rear, her white shawl fluttering amid the smoke. Her cannons struck the heart of the Italian center, scattering men and horses. Meanwhile, Ras Mikhail's troops cut through the left flank, while Ras Alula and Jida encircled from the north. Within hours, the Italians were trapped in a ring of fire. Baratieri's officers shouted commands in panic. Ammunition ran low. Communications failed. Entire battalions were swallowed by the Ethiopian advance. Menelik rode among his troops, urging them on, not with promises of gold, but of dignity. "This day," he cried, "we fight not for land, but for the name of our fathers." By midday, the battlefield was chaos, smoke, blood, banners, and cries blending into a single storm. The Italians fought bravely, but they were strangers in a land that refused to yield. By afternoon, the imperial army had split their ranks, capturing guns, standards, and prisoners. When the sun began to sink behind the hills, the white flag appeared. The Italian army had collapsed. Over Nana men were dead or captured. Thousands more fled into the mountains. The tricolor flag of Italy lay trampled in the dust, its colors dull beneath Ethiopian boots. As silence fell, Menelik dismounted. He looked over the valley where so many had fallen and crossed himself slowly. "Enough blood," he said. "Let those who surrender live." Even in victory, mercy guided him. That night, the mountains of Adwa glowed with campfires and hymns. Priests sang songs of deliverance. Soldiers wept in disbelief. The impossible had happened. An African army had defeated a European empire. From Cairo to Harlem, from Accra to Paris, the news spread like wildfire. For the colonized and the enslaved, Adwa was more than a battle. It was proof that freedom could still be defended with courage and unity. And in the quiet of his tent, Menelik prayed once more. "God of Ethiopia," he whispered, "you have shown that our people shall not perish." In the months that followed Adwa, Ethiopia stood taller than ever before. The impossible victory had shattered Europe's myth of racial superiority. For the first time in modern history, an African nation had forced a European power to recognize its independence. Menelik entered the city of Addis Ababa, not as a conqueror, but as a visionary. He knew victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. "We have won our freedom," he told his ministers, "but we must now learn to preserve it. To survive in a world carved by colonial empires, Ethiopia would have to modernize not as an imitation of Europe, but on its own terms." Under his rule, Addis Ababa transformed from a dusty military camp into a capital of progress. The emperor ordered the construction of roads, bridges, and schools. He introduced electricity, telegraphs, and a national currency. A railway line connecting the Red Sea to the highlands began to rise, symbolizing Ethiopia's link between tradition and modernity. Menelik welcomed foreign engineers and doctors, but never let them rule. He wrote, "We take their science, not their spirit." His government established ministries for justice, finance, and education. Priests taught not only scripture, but mathematics and geography. The same emperor who once wielded a sword now held a blueprint for an African renaissance. Yet power always comes with shadow. Italy, humiliated, signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa in Sempachak-Ujralda, recognizing Ethiopia's sovereignty. But in European capitals, resentment brewed. Colonial powers watched Menelik's success with envy and unease. They saw in him not merely a ruler, but a symbol, a king who had made the empire bleed. Within Ethiopia, prosperity brought new tensions. Nobles competed for influence, and modernization clashed with old hierarchies. Menelik navigated these rivalries with patience. His court became a mirror of his character, stern but fair, traditional yet curious. He would spend hours discussing artillery logistics, then end the evening listening to poetry sung in ancient Giza. Visitors from abroad described him as a man of contradictions, tall, broad-shouldered, with calm eyes that revealed both warmth and warning. He was courteous to Europeans, yet unyielding in dignity. A French envoy once remarked, "He speaks softly, but when he pauses, even the air waits." Menelik's vision extended beyond his lifetime. He established diplomatic relations with Russia, Britain, and France, ensuring Ethiopia's place among sovereign nations. He dreamed of an Africa that could negotiate rather than kneel, a continent that would remember Adwa not as an exception, but as a beginning. In his later years, when courtiers asked what he desired most, he simply said, "Light." They thought he meant electricity, but those who knew him understood he meant enlightenment, the light of dignity and knowledge that could never be colonized. And so the emperor who had once led barefoot soldiers through the dust now stood beneath the glow of newly installed lamps in Addis Ababa, their golden light flickering against the night sky. The Lion of Shua had become the Emperor of Light. The war had proven his strength. Now, peace would test his wisdom. By the first years of the 20th century, Emperor Menelik II had become one of the most admired figures in the world and one of the most burdened. Ethiopia stood uncolonized, its sovereignty intact, but the emperor's body had begun to betray him. The years of war, negotiation, and unrelenting responsibility had worn him thin. His once commanding stride slowed. His hair, once black as volcanic rock, had turned white like the highland frost. In Senkyu Bikro, he suffered the first of several strokes. At first, he dismissed it as fatigue, continuing his daily counsels, inspecting roads, and the growing railway project that would one day link Addis Ababa to the coast. But the signs were clear: trembling hands, uneven speech, and moments of lost memory. The man who had once moved armies now struggled to move his own legs. Still, Menelik refused to show weakness in public. Every morning, he sat on his throne, dressed in his ceremonial robes, surrounded by courtiers who bowed in silence. The people who came to the palace still saw their emperor, the Lion of Judah, unbroken, untamed. Only his closest attendants knew how much pain he endured, or how often he fell into quiet confusion, staring out toward the mountains as if listening for voices from the past. His wife, Empress Taitu Betul, took command of state affairs, protecting her husband's dignity and guarding the throne from opportunists. Yet her assertiveness angered many nobles, and the court began to divide. Ambitious princes whispered that the empire needed a new ruler, one who could guide the nation into the new century. Menelik, trapped between lucidity and frailty, tried to maintain peace. He appointed Ras Bitwadad Tessema Nadu as regent, hoping to ensure stability after his death. But within months, the regent died suddenly, and the empire again found itself on the edge of intrigue. In these final years, Ethiopia itself seemed to mirror the emperor's condition. Proud, but fragile. Modern, yet haunted by old rivalries. The telegraph lines hummed with progress, but in the countryside, famine and disease still took lives. The railway crept forward, but so did resentment among nobles, fearful of losing traditional power. Menelik had forged a nation out of chaos, but he could not forge unity of hearts overnight. Visitors to Addis Ababa in those years described a strange atmosphere, reverence mingled with dread. Outside the palace, merchants traded in markets lit by the city's new electric lamps, while inside, the emperor lay in silence, his breath shallow, his mind wandering through the corridors of memory. Sometimes he would murmur names from the past, Ras Alula, Johannes, Tetu, or whisper the word Adwa, as though reliving the thunder of that immortal day. He had outlived most of his allies and enemies. His victories had outlasted his strength. And yet, even in his decline, his presence anchored Ethiopia. People believed that as long as Menelik still breathed, the nation would not fall. On the morning of Sencho Fan, Nentunigajunuj, the emperor's breathing slowed to a whisper. In the quiet of his palace, surrounded by the scent of incense and prayer, Menelik II passed away. The Lion of Shua, the conqueror of Adwa, the builder of modern Ethiopia was gone, but death did not bring silence. Across the highlands, church bells tolled for 3 days and nights. Peasants knelt in fields. Priests chanted his name. The mountains themselves seemed to echo with mourning. For Ethiopia, it was not merely the passing of a ruler, it was the end of an age. In the decades that followed Menelik's death, the world he had resisted came like a tide. New empires rose, wars reshaped borders, and Europe's colonial fever continued to consume Africa. Yet Ethiopia remained free, the only ancient African kingdom never colonized, standing like a solitary torch in a continent of conquest. The victory at Adwa became legend. It was sung in churches and whispered in freedom movements across the world. In the Caribbean and the Americas, descendants of enslaved Africans spoke Menelik's name as a symbol of dignity. In Harlem, poets and preachers invoked Ethiopia as proof that black sovereignty was not a dream but a fact. Across West Africa, nationalist leaders drew inspiration from his defiance. Even Mahatma Gandhi and W.E.B. Du Bois would later cite Ethiopia's triumph as an example of moral resistance. Within Ethiopia itself, his successors continued his legacy of modernization. Roads stretched farther, schools multiplied, and the memory of Menelik's discipline guided generations. But the nation also faced the cost of independence, political unrest, social divides, and future wars. When Italy returned under Mussolini in the Senkyufyaksanjabyo, Ethiopia once again had to defend its freedom. And though Menelik was long gone, it was his spirit, his belief that no foreign power could own the soul of Ethiopia, that guided Emperor Haile Selassie and his people through that ordeal. Menelik's palace in Addis Ababa became a place of pilgrimage. His image, calm and unyielding, hung in homes, churches, and government halls. His tomb, sealed in the Ba'atul Mariam church, glowed beneath the light of candles, kept burning by generations who refused to forget. Historians often call him the architect of modern Ethiopia, but for his people, he was more than that. He was the bridge between past and future, between the ancient faith of the mountains and the new light of progress. His victory at Adwa did not merely save a nation, it restored the dignity of a continent. And so, when Africans across the diaspora looked for symbols of hope, they looked to Ethiopia, to the lion who had slept behind chains as a boy and awakened to defy empires as a man. Menelik II proved that the power of a people united in purpose could break even the iron of empire. His name still carries the rhythm of the mountains and the whisper of prayer. Steady, patient, eternal. In the end, Ethiopia's light outlasted every map drawn in Berlin. The nations that once sought to divide her crumbled under their own weight. But the land Menelik defended still stands, proud and sovereign. The story of Emperor Menelik II is not only history, it is a reminder that dignity can be a weapon, that unity can outshine armies, and that even a mountain can roar loud enough to shake the world. Because in the heart of Ethiopia, beneath the same sun that once burned over Adwa, the crown that refused to bow still glitters untamed, unbroken, and free.